Hi, everybody. My name is John Busby. I'm the managing director of BroadbandNow, and I'm very excited for you to watch today's interview with Bill Stewart, who's the founder and creator of livinginternet.com, which is now hosted on BroadbandNow at broadbandnow.com/internet. Bill published the first web ebook on January 7th, 2000. It covers the early days of the internet. And as you'll see in this interview, when we're talking about the early days of the internet, we're not talking about the early 90s or whenever the World Wide Web sprung to life. We're talking about the vision and technology and innovations of the early pioneers starting in the 40s. I learned a lot from this interview. I think you can see Bill's passion. You can read all about the early days of the internet and even more into modern times up until the year 2000 and beyond on Living Internet. Thanks very much. Hi, I'm John Busby, Managing Director of BroadbandNow. We're very happy to announce today that the first ebook ever published, Living Internet, is now being hosted on BroadbandNow and covers the early history of the internet. I'm talking with Living Internet's creator, Bill Stewart, today about the book and about his work. Hi, Bill. How are you?
Hi, John. I'm great. How about yourself?
Doing good. I'm really thrilled to have your work hosted on BroadbandNow, and I wanted to give a little bit of a preview for those who haven't read it as part of this interview. One of the things that really struck me in reading your book is that we tend to think of the internet as starting with the web, or at least I did. But one of the things I realized when reading it is actually really went back a lot further than that. Isn't that true?
Yeah, it really is. And that's one of the things that really struck me when I started looking into it was this technology was developed by a whole bunch of people with a vision that went back a long time. And it was a vision about developing a technology that would really help humanity. That was the impetus behind a lot of it. Today we have this amazing technology and it feels like servers and networks, but it would never have existed if there weren't people going back to really as early as 1945 that wanted to realize the potential of technology to help humanity move forward.
So I'm sure you've heard the joke before about Al Gore inventing the internet or not inventing the internet. Maybe you'll tell me later his role or not his role. But if you had to pick a modern starting point around the 40s for the development of the internet, who would you choose as a true pioneer?
The vision really probably originated with a guy by the name of Vannevar Bush. Vannevar was a very interesting guy, and he wrote an article way back in 1945 about something called what he called Memex. Technology was starting to get serious in the 1940s. We're moving beyond planes and cars and railroads. And he saw that this was going somewhere. So he wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly about something that he described as Memex, kind of a universal library. I'll just give you a quick quote here from his paper. He said, he wrote, consider a future device for individual use, which is a sort of mechanized private file and library, a device in which an individual stores all his books, records, and communications and may be consulted with exceeding speed and flexibility. It is an enlarged supplement to his memory. It consists of a desk and can presumably be operated from a distance. On the top are slanting, translucent screens on which material can be projected for convenient reading. There is a keyboard. So that was really the founding document in a modern sense. And it had a big influence on a lot of people at the time and all of the key figures that led up to the original creation of the internet.
That's a really cool quote. And something I also found interesting when reading through your work was, fast forward a little bit to the 50s, there was a big tug of war between the US and Soviet Union on virtually everything, the race to space, nuclear weapons, and so on. Maybe you can tell me about milestones that happened around that time.
Yeah, that was the key date was 1958. 1958, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite. Arthur C. Clarke said, maybe if we put things up at a certain height, they'll stay right over the Earth as the Earth moves. Create these things called satellites, might be useful for something. Well, the Soviet Union beat the rest of the world to that, and that got a lot of people's attention, in particular Eisenhower's. So Eisenhower created something called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, to develop R&D projects with no bureaucracy. The thinking was it was this bureaucracy, the paperwork, that was slowing things down. So we'll just go right around it, create an organization that can do whatever they want. If you've got a researcher, a scientist that wants a widget, he doesn't have to fill out forms and go through a 12-month procurement process. They'll just go buy him the widget. So that was a key step forward. And it's always seemed to me interesting that so much of the funding and so much of the original development of the internet came from the US Department of National Defense, because the Cold War was real. If you're born after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, it's ancient history. But I remember all of us walked around every day wondering if the world was going to end without notice. It was a level of anxiety and fear that just disappeared in 1989. But back then it was real. The Soviet Union were bad guys, and they were really bad. And we were worried about that. So Eisenhower established DARPA, and it's always seemed interesting to me that so much of this technology, which has really advanced human capability, came from that fear of the Cold War. From fear of destruction came life.
Wow. Yeah, that I only have small memories of the Berlin Wall coming down. And it's interesting that a lot of this started with a satellite. Now we have tens of thousands of satellites orbiting the Earth, providing internet. Elon Musk, I know, has a vision to provide internet to the world through a constellation of low Earth orbit satellites. Okay, so let's keep moving on. If Vannevar Bush was a visionary, I think also J.C.R. Licklider was as well.
Yeah, J.C.R. Licklider was a really interesting guy, a little eccentric, had an amazing vision. One of the things that DARPA did was they established the IPTO, the Information Processing Techniques Office, and they hired Licklider in '62 to run it, probably because of the paper he had written in 1960 called Man-Computer Symbiosis. He was the next step in this vision of how technology could really extend human capabilities. And he wrote a paper. I'll give you another quote from that particular paper. He wrote, "It seems reasonable to envision a thinking center that will incorporate the functions of present-day libraries. The picture readily enlarges itself into a network of such centers, connected to one another by wideband communication lines and to individual users by leased wire services." So he had that vision, building on the MEMEX idea, which of course he was aware of, on how technology could help. And the advancement of technology was getting to the point where we could start to connect things so they could communicate with that larger vision again of extending human capabilities.
One of the next figures that is prominent in your work is Paul Baran. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but it looks like he also had a background in defense, back to the theme of creating life from fear of destruction.
Yes, exactly. Well, I'll mention a little bit later how all of this kind of separated off from the military side. But the key technology that runs the internet and is responsible for the freedom and openness of the internet was developed by Paul Baran when he was asked in 1960 by the Rand Corporation to develop a communications network that could survive a nuclear war. People were worried that if there was a nuclear war, entire cities could be lost. And so there wouldn't be the ability to have different sites and computers be able to communicate. So he was given the goal, well, solve that. How can we create a communications network which is completely invulnerable to any kind of attack? And of course, at the time, that was an impossible goal. But he came up with a solution. His solution was, if you've got a communication that you want to have between any 2 points, instead of setting up a dedicated communications line, the way even phone calls tend to operate often today, there's a dedicated line. His idea was, we'll take that communication and we'll divide it up into thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands or millions of little packets of information. We'll send them out on the network to the next node in the network, and then that node will look around and say, well, how can I get it to the next node? And if that node was down, it would say, well, I'll send some over there. And if that node was busy, it would say, well, I'll send half to on that link and half to that link. And then the next node in the chain would say, well, okay, a little bit closer. How can we get it closer again? It would look around to whatever it was connected to, these days internet routers, and send some of the communications to that router, maybe some to that router. Eventually, if there was any surviving link from here to there, they'd all get to the far side, be reassembled, put in order, and you would have your graphic or text or whatever it was that you were trying to communicate. Well, this was an amazing idea. It had two incredible benefits. The first benefit was resilience. There was no central node. There was no central switch. There was no way to take out the network. You might have to send it backwards around the world through a web of connections. But if there was any way to get from here to where you wanted to communicate to, that technology would eventually get the packets there. They need to be retransmitted. They'd be retransmitted, go by some other route if you're missing a few. So it was resilient. And there was no central control, no way to exert central control. But it had another amazing benefit as well, capacity. And the old way of communicating was setting up a dedicated link and you connected. And if you weren't using it, if someone wasn't talking for a few seconds, for example, that link was dedicated. It was used. No one else would use it. If you split every communication up into packets, some of them quite small, well, they could all, one after another, fit on the link as long as there was some capacity. So you could mix voice, you could mix images, you could mix text, you could mix any kind of communications. So that meant that a relatively small network, if that link was full, if it was congested, well, we'd just send some over there and maybe mix some up over there. A relatively small communications network could support an incredible number of connections. All you had to do was be connected to any node on the network. And then the network would take care of it from there. So that simple idea of packet switching developed by Paul Baran is responsible more than anything else for the freedom, the openness, the resilience, and the incredible capacity that the internet as we know it has today.
That's a very cool story. And I think we're approaching, although we're not quite there, the actual first internet. Tell me about Robert Taylor.
Yeah, it all started to come together now. Robert Taylor took over the IPTO from Ivan Sutherland, who took it over from J.C.R. Licklider, and the pieces came together. The way the story goes, the way Taylor told the story, he was sitting at his desk one day, and he had 3 computer terminals, different types of computer terminals sitting on his desk, and each of them was connected over a separate communications link to 3 different sites that he needed to communicate with. So he was thinking about this, and he said, well, this is out of control. You know, what if I wanted to talk to a dozen sites or 100 different sites? They need 100 different terminals and 100 different communications links, most of which I'd never be using. Let's realize Licklider's and Vannevar Bush's idea of a universal network. So what did he do? He hired a project manager to make it happen, Larry Roberts. And Larry Roberts was given the funding. It was DARPA. You want money? Here's money. You need more money? Let me know. I'll give you more money. Go make it happen. We're DARPA. So Larry Roberts, he hired Leonard Kleinrock at UCLA and said, let's create a computer that can use this packet switching idea of Baran's idea that and start putting up 4 nodes. We'll start with 4 nodes to start with that will realize this idea of a universal vision. And so he did. And the first 4 sites were, just let me get this right. The first 4 sites were at the UCLA at Berkeley, at the Stanford Research Institute, the University of California at Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. The first one went live 1970. They had a communication, and it started to grow from there. And that was important because the first 4 sites were research organizations, universities and research organizations. So that meant that the first people on what later became the internet, at the time they called it the ARPANET, the first 4 sites being researchers and scientists, meant once they got their fingers onto it, they were going to play. They were going to have fun. They very much believed in openness. They believed in freedom of information. They believed in innovation. So as time went by, they started to say, wow, we could use it for this, we could use it for that. And they started innovating technologies like email, like the first news groups, like internet relay chat, the first chat. And it just started to grow from there. It was originally called the ARPANET, but it quickly got loose of that. The ARPANET split off, and the military went off and did their own thing because the research side was just growing so fast. So the National Science Foundation took over it from there, and it became called the NSFNet. And of course, you can imagine what happened. If you were a university and you weren't on the NSFNet, you'd hear about it, you'd get really jealous, and you'd say, well, we've got to have a site too. We got to connect to it. So it just started to grow and grow and grow. It went international. It went to Canada, the CSNet. It went to Europe, the EUNet. And this universal network using packet switching just started to grow right around the world.
That's a really great story. It's getting my spine tingling here. For everybody watching, the rest of this story is described in great detail, and everything that Bill was talking about earlier on Living Internet. So I encourage everybody to read that. Let me ask you, Bill, about thoughts on today. Where do you see everything going? How do you sum up where we are, kind of fast forwarding to our current times of the internet?
Sure. Just one other thing I should mention, the development of the web itself. Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn developed TCP/IP, which was kind of an advanced form of packet switching. And that allowed the internet to grow technically so fast. And amazingly enough, is still the technology we use today. Vint Cerf told me once that he only really expected there to be a maximum of 200 nodes on the network. So they didn't really expect this technology needed to support more than that, but it did. And we're still using TCP/IP today. The thing that really helped the internet take off from there, after the general public started to become aware of it, commercial networks were allowed to tap in. If you had a computer at home and a modem, you could connect up, get your own email address. It started to grow from there, but what really caused the explosive growth, of course, was the web. Because before that, to connect to another site, you had to type. You had to type some commands and maybe enter a password, or maybe specify, did you want to use ASCII or binary in your communication? You needed to type some stuff. Well, Tim Berners-Lee over in Europe, he thought this should be a lot easier. So he created something called a web server, a web browser and a web server. And that innovation, the reason that was so successful was because it made the internet point and click easy. Anybody could use it. One of the things I've noticed as I looked at a lot of these technologies, TCP/IP, packet switching, others, is simplicity was the reason for the success. Something can be amazing, but if it's complicated, it's not going to get as much traction. The web made things easy. If you wanted to go to a site, if you wanted to go to some library or some repository of information or some news group, you could just click on a link and there it would be. So that created exponential growth. There's lots of graphs. Some of them are linked on livinginternet.com, showing that kind of internet growth from there. And now we've got it all around the world. We developed search engines. Google came up with this idea of, instead of building directories like the original Yahoo, what we would do is we would say that a site would be useful if it had more links to it. So they would go scan the web, and if you're searching for ultimate frisbee, you type in ultimate frisbee. If there was a site that had more links than some other site to that site on this early web, it was probably more useful. So it took off from there, and then we got social media, etc. So what do I think of all of this today? Well, the reason I originally created the Living Internet was so that people would remember the human origins of this, that they would have some sense of the fact that people developed it very deliberately and developed it to help people, to create openness of communication, to link things. And they believed this would have positive effects. And I think it certainly has. But as we look at it today, there is some concern. There is some concern about whether or not the internet has been a positive force. And we look at some of the concerning things, the way it can amplify negative information, the way we can spend a lot of time on social media. And there's been some thinking, some questioning about whether or not this is a good thing. Well, for whatever it's worth, I'm absolutely convinced it is. There's no question about it. Because what we are seeing here really is the development of a living internet, something that's greater than the sum of the parts and is pulling all of humanity together, exactly as Licklider envisioned. Kind of as an analogy, the human brain consists of a whole bunch of billions of individual neurons, which don't do that much by themselves. But once they're connected by networks, often electric networks, they start to be able to have greater capabilities and do more interesting things. Well, that's what the internet is doing. It's our global nervous system. Analogously, us as individuals, our individual neurons, and now instead of being limited to communication through individual hierarchies in silos, we can communicate crosswise to anybody. And we're starting to develop. And like a human brain, it doesn't always start that functional. Early on, it might scream and yell and thrash out a little bit and go through some dysfunctionalities. But eventually, human beings and human brains mature. Eventually, it takes longer for some of us. Maybe I'm just speaking about myself, but eventually we tend to get there and become mature and functional. Well, we need to give the internet time as well. If I had to guess, I'd say we're in early adolescence. There's been a fair number of amazing functional things. It's helped freedom around the world. It's helped emerging democracies. There's been some dysfunctionalities, but it's going through the process. And eventually, it will help us realize our ultimate destiny. Without this electronic nervous system to connect us all into this larger living global consciousness, we wouldn't be able to get there. We needed the internet to develop, to allow us to reach the next level in our human development. If you believe that the human destiny is a good one, if you believe that the center of the human heart is more good than bad, which I certainly believe, the internet is going to help us get to that good next level. We're on the journey. I just hope that the Living Internet helps the site helps everyone remember that this didn't happen by accident. It was developed very purposefully by the originators to help realize that kind of open, better vision. We're on the way.
Bill, I love that. I love your passion about this, and I agree, and will become and what it is today. I wish we were doing this in person, but thankfully we have a way of communicating in video during a pandemic, thanks to what these early pioneers did for us in its evolution. So thanks again. I wish you the best throughout the rest of the year and throughout the holidays. And thanks for joining.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it. Have fun with it.